Tonight, we begin with a regulatory shift that transportation officials had anticipated, debated, and quietly prepared for. A legislative overhaul that unfolded not over months of public hearings, but in a single January session. A single session that rewrote decades of traffic law. A single session that made millions of licenses technically non-compliant. A single session that introduced penalties most drivers don't even know exist yet. What state legislatures did in early 2026 crossed a line that automotive advocacy groups had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, the Department of Transportation did not hesitate. They responded with swift implementation, aggressive enforcement timelines, and mandatory compliance deadlines that leave no room for ignorance. For 18 months now, there had been whispers. Not official announcements, not press conferences, just whispers that lawmakers were preparing something comprehensive. Traffic safety committees have been data-driven, yes, but they have been remarkably coordinated in their data-driven approach. Their proposals have followed a certain pattern, a rhythm, almost a choreography across state lines. But what set off alarm bells in driver advocacy organizations this winter was that the pattern went silent. Legal experts who monitor traffic legislation know the indicators: the public comment periods, the draft bill leaks, the industry lobbying pushback, the sudden media coverage. All of that went quiet, and whenever legislative chambers go quiet on controversial reforms, it means something is about to get loud. Early January, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration detected what they described as synchronized legislative action, including enforcement mechanisms that had not been coordinated across multiple states in over 15 years. These are the kinds of regulatory frameworks that lawmakers only deploy when they are signaling something very specific: federal pressure, insurance industry demands, or public safety emergencies. Traffic safety observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that state transportation departments were changing enforcement posture. And when regulatory bodies shift enforcement posture without extensive public education campaigns, even by modest measures, driver advocacy groups pay attention. The guidance issued by the Department of Transportation in late January was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Press release after emergency meeting described the legislative changes as immediate, enforceable with existing infrastructure, and perhaps most importantly, carrying penalties that escalate rapidly with each violation, including license suspension protocols that bypass traditional grace periods. But regulatory shock only works if the public hesitates. Informed drivers did not. In fact, their response in February was among the most aggressive information-seeking behavior we've seen in transportation policy updates. Here's what we know. Within 72 hours of implementation announcements, state DMV websites crashed under traffic loads. These weren't the typical renewal inquiries. These were panicked compliance checks, searches and verification requests that drivers only make when they are preparing to avoid serious legal consequences. Tonight, transportation officials confirmed that enforcement agencies launched compliance monitoring on 10 specific regulations, including digital verification systems that had recently been upgraded for what analysts believe was precisely this purpose. Law enforcement began ticketing before most drivers could adjust their behavior. They targeted hands-free violations. They targeted speed limit compliance in new school zones. They targeted registration display requirements that were likely preparing to support automated enforcement systems. In other words, police departments targeted the infrastructure of compliance, the behavioral changes that would have made the transition smooth. This is what made the Department of Transportation's timeline so urgent. The legislative package wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of regulatory shift that could generate millions in citation revenue if left unexplained. And enforcement agencies, understanding that fully, responded with vigor. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't focus on rural backroads. They didn't target low traffic hours. They hit morning commutes. They hit school drop-off zones. And here's where the story becomes even more complex. Legal analysts now believe that lawmakers' latest package was designed to test the acceptance of automated enforcement after years of public resistance to traffic cameras. Legislators wanted to see whether voters would tolerate enhanced surveillance. But instead, the opposite happened. Driver advocacy groups didn't accept the changes quietly. They launched information campaigns that were so rapid, so coordinated, that even state senators noticed. You don't get legislators' attention easily during implementation phases. But in February, organized drivers did. Transportation policy experts speaking with legal publications under anonymity described the legislative strategy as incremental normalization, a way to introduce controversial enforcement mechanisms alongside uncontroversial safety measures. But informed drivers proved in February that they remain both vigilant and organized. Their response was not only swift, they were precise enough that several state representatives requested implementation delays for specific provisions. That political pressure matters because it shows legislative vulnerability. It shows that transportation departments are not operating in a vacuum. They are responding to organized constituent resistance. As reports continued coming in throughout February, we learned more about the scale of the regulatory changes. California implemented mandatory rear seat belt enforcement, with primary violation status, forcing a fundamental shift in passenger behavior statewide. Texas expanded school zone speed cameras that had been pilot tested in the last 6 months, now generating automated citations. Florida authorities operating throughout the state reportedly began confiscating vehicles used by drivers with suspended licenses to combat repeat offenders. This wasn't just tougher enforcement. This wasn't just higher fines. This was behavioral engineering. This was infrastructure-supported compliance automation. And infrastructure-supported automation is the one thing driver privacy advocates have struggled to prevent since red light cameras became widespread. For every legal challenge they have mounted, transportation departments have countered with something that expands automated enforcement scope. Remember, lawmakers thought drivers would accept these changes gradually. They thought public attention would focus on the safety messaging. They thought enforcement would ramp up slowly enough to avoid backlash. But in February, the exact opposite is happening. Drivers are learning about all 10 changes simultaneously. Social media is amplifying the most controversial provisions, and enforcement is generating pushback in swing district constituencies. What makes this moment so significant and so volatile is that these legislative changes happened at a time when state budgets are under revenue pressure. Progressive lawmakers want expanded public transit investment. Conservative lawmakers want lower vehicle registration fees. Insurance companies want data-driven rate structures. And civil liberties organizations want limits on surveillance infrastructure. Governors are balancing these demands while facing re-election considerations. And when leaders in that position make sudden regulatory moves, they're not doing it from consensus. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from competing stakeholder demands. The Department of Transportation's guidance memo, now distributed to all state DMVs, was designed to signal that federal authorities are not willing to allow state-by-state implementation chaos. Officials said plainly that drivers' behavior regarding the new laws must be consistent with immediate compliance expectations. That is bureaucratic language for, ignorance of these changes is not a legal defense, and enforcement begins now. You don't usually hear that tone from transportation agencies unless significant citation revenue projections are at stake. Meanwhile, the National Motorists Association president addressed concerned drivers in a detailed technical briefing this week. She said, "These changes represent the most significant expansion of traffic enforcement authority in a generation." She said, 4 of these 10 laws introduce penalties that most drivers have never encountered. And she said, Law number 4, the hands-free device requirement, carries penalties that escalate to license suspension on the 3rd violation within 12 months. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from an organization that understands just how high the financial and legal stakes have become for average drivers. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. The hands-free law wasn't isolated. Along with that primary enforcement change, 6 states also implemented mandatory ignition interlock devices for first-time DUI offenders. 12 states increased penalties for expired registration beyond simple fines to include vehicle impoundment. 8 states expanded automated speed enforcement in construction zones, targeting violations previously handled with warnings. All of this happened within the same 30-day implementation window. When state legislatures move multiple enforcement mechanisms at once, it means something larger is underway. Legal analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that states are preparing for federal transportation funding that requires enhanced enforcement infrastructure. Another is that insurance industry lobbying is attempting to shift liability verification onto automated systems. A third possibility, the one worrying privacy advocates the most, is that lawmakers are attempting to normalize comprehensive vehicle tracking as standard enforcement practice. But in February, informed drivers took awareness off the table. They didn't ignore the changes. They didn't assume grace periods. They didn't wait for official notification. They researched, shared information, and demanded clarity. What we're watching now is a test of civic engagement. Legislators want to see how quickly compliance becomes automatic. Drivers want to show that surveillance expansion requires public debate. Transportation departments want to prevent the enforcement chaos that happened with marijuana legalization. And civil liberties groups want to prevent precedent setting for future automated regulation. Tonight, we've heard from legal aid organizations who are now offering free compliance workshops. They say law number 4, hands-free requirements, is generating the most confusion. They say enforcement is already underway in 7 states. And they say lawmakers' decision to implement without extensive public education campaigns is likely part of revenue acceleration strategies intended to close budget shortfalls. But drivers are not remaining uninformed. In fact, community organizations are responding with grassroots education efforts. Their response in February, rapid, organized, and widely shared on social media, sent a message to state legislatures that voters are paying attention. And it sent a message to transportation departments that implementation without education generates political consequences. As February continues, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly lawmakers hope to achieve with this synchronized rollout. But what we do know is that driver awareness campaigns were timely. They prevented widespread citation surges. They forced several states to delay certain enforcement provisions. And they demonstrated that informed communities can influence regulatory implementation. What happens next will depend on what state legislatures do in the next 90 days. If they introduce grace periods and public education funding, this moment will be remembered as responsive governance. If they proceed with aggressive enforcement, driver advocacy organizations have already shown they are mobilized. They have shown they are ready to respond with legal challenges and ballot initiatives. And tonight, for the first time in years, state transportation departments appear to be reconsidering implementation timelines. Legislative offices are quiet, too quiet. And when lawmakers are quiet after public pushback, it means they are recalculating political costs. It means they are choosing their next enforcement steps carefully. Because in February 2026, legislators learned something they should have known from previous regulatory overreach. Drivers vote, drivers organize, and drivers remember which officials expanded enforcement without public input. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. The 10 new driving laws are real, the penalties are enforceable, and the driver who knows law number 4, mandatory hands-free compliance with escalating suspension penalties, is the driver who avoids the citation that costs not just money, but their license. And we will be here, watching every detail, as the next phase of this regulatory transformation unfolds.